Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another Minecraft architecture tutorial. My name is Shells, and today we're going to be talking about Greek architecture and the classical orders. So when you see people build Greek architecture in Minecraft, you're probably used to seeing something that looks kind of like this. Isn't it cute? And to be fair, this has all of the essential elements that make up a Greek temple. So if this is the size you want to build your temple, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But for this video, we're actually going to scale it up a tad so we can really show off all the nitty-gritty details. Here, I have built a full replica of the Parthenon. Now, I chose the Parthenon because it pretty well encompasses all of the values you'd expect to see in an ancient Greek temple. It was styled after the Doric order and had all of the perfect ratios that Greek architects considered to be the perfect proportions, with beautiful sculptures and subtle curvatures. Well, at least it did before it was defaced multiple times, and then some genius decided it would be a great place to store a bunch of gunpowder and the whole thing blew up. But that's beside the point. This is my attempt to recreate the temple to Athena in its original glory. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Greek architecture is a post and lintel type of construction. If you're unfamiliar with the term, basically the building consists of posts holding up a horizontal element called a lintel. But the Greeks decided that they were too good for the names post and lintel and replaced them with fancier terms like columns and entablature. Now, obviously there are some nuanced differences between the terms, but for our purposes, think of them as one and the same. So here's a nice little diagram of the front of a typical Greek temple. We have our columns and our entablature. The stepped base is called a crepidoma, with the top step supporting the columns being called the stylobate. The column is separated into three main parts: the base, the shaft, and the capital. And to top everything off, the triangular piece holding up the roof is called the pediment. Alright, now we're going to focus more on what your columns should look like, so we're going to talk about the classical orders of architecture. The classical orders are distinct building styles that arose in ancient architecture and are often distinguished by the way the columns looked. There are 5 different orders, though technically only the first 3 are Greek and the last 2 are Roman, but they're still worth talking about. The orders are Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, Tuscan, and Composite. So let's go ahead and go through each of them. The Doric order is the simplest one. It has no base, only a shaft and a capital, and the capital tends to be a little bit more simple and unadorned, flaring a little bit before being capped by a giant square. The shaft is almost always fluted, which means that it has these scalloped channels cut into the length of it. The Doric order tends to be a little bit squatter and girthier, and was considered a more masculine style, and so was put into things like the Temple of Zeus. The Ionic order has a round base and is a little bit more slender, with the fluting closer together, and the shaft a little bit taller relative to the diameter of the column. The capital consists of 2 scroll-like swirly-dirly things called volutes that sit on either side of the column. The Ionic order tends to be more feminine and, perhaps because of the scrolls, was also typically used for academic buildings. Next is the Corinthian order, which has a similar, if slightly more ornate, base and shaft than the Ionic order, but is even more slender and slightly taller. The most interesting part of the Corinthian order is, of course, the capital. The capital is made to look like a basket of acanthus leaves. It's very organic looking, with several layers of progressively larger leaves branching out. Moving on to the Roman classical orders, we have the Tuscan order. This one is an awful lot like the Doric order, but it tends to be even more simplified, foregoing the fluted shaft for a smoother, more robust feel. It tends to be the sturdiest looking of the bunch, giving off a feel of dominance and power. It's like T-posing with architecture. I actually think I have this one a little bit too tall and slender. It's more similar to the Corinthian order. I think it's supposed to be more short and squat, similar to what you got with the Doric order, but that's alright. The last one is the Composite order. It tends to get mistaken for the Corinthian order, but it's actually a combination of both Corinthian and Ionic. with the acanthus leaf basket capital, but then also adorned at the very top with volutes. So now that you know what they all look like, let's go ahead and talk little bit about how to build them in Minecraft. Let's start by talking about the shape of the column. Something you may have noticed, especially in this Doric order column, is that the columns are not straight up and down. They do not stay the same diameter from top to bottom. Generally, the base of the column is going to be a lot thicker than the top of the shaft, partly because you want the weight of the column to be centered at the bottom so it's less likely to tip over. Remember, weevils wobble but they don't fall down. Beyond that, the columns actually swell a little bit before tapering at the top. This is what's called entasis. It's up for debate as to why they do that, but it's been theorized that the ancient architects were trying to make the columns look, well, more straight up and down by making them not straight up and down. See, when you have straight lines holding up a large horizontal element like the entablature, our eyes tend to play tricks on us and makes it look like those straight poles are concave and visually bent inwards. So to counter that weird visual effect, the columns actually curve outwards just a little to make it look more straight. Now, of course, if your pillar is only 1 block thick, you're going to have a hard time showing the subtle curvature a Greek column is supposed to have. So if this is as big as you're going to build, by all means, keep it simple. But if you're going to make your column any bigger than that, please consider trying to put at least a little bit of shape to your pillars. Nothing bothers me more than seeing someone proudly present their Greek temple and their columns look like this. Like, at the very least, try to make the pillars round. It's not that hard to make a plus shape. If you are building on a larger scale, and by larger I mean bigger than a plus shape, I'll go ahead and show you what to do to make your columns just a little bit more shapely. The first thing you'll want to do is lay down some circles for the diameters of your columns. You should have a circle for your base, for the top, and for the middle, with the middle one being the largest and the top one being the smallest. Alternatively, you can keep the base the largest, since technically the entasis rarely, if ever, outswelled the base of the column, but I find that if you make the middle one bigger, it really emphasizes the curvature of your column. These circles should be pretty similar in size, so don't go too crazy making like the middle one super fat or anything. Also, your middle should not be right in the halfway point between the top and the bottom. Remember, you want the center of gravity on your pillars to be lower, so the girthy part of your shaft should be a little bit closer to the ground. So that's actually right in the middle right now, so we're going to drop it by like, 5 blocks. Move 5. Boink. That's too much. Move 3. That's better. Alright, so therefore, it kind of almost looks more like a bottle shape than anything else. Now you might be tempted to just kind of chunk out your circles like this. All I did for this was just, extend those circles out until they met each other. But you'll notice that this guy does not look very pleasant. It's kind of chunky. So what you're instead going to do is you actually want to take from your middle circle, you're actually going to draw more of a teardrop shape. So in this instance, we would actually extend this up a little bit more. And we could create, especially as you go bigger, you're going to try to make more of an oval shape or a teardrop sort of shape out of this center section. I might even extend it a little bit more out to the sides here, but then keep in mind you have to make all of the sides equal. So here we've got more of a teardrop, and it actually looks a little bit better. You might even push it a little bit more. I think this looks too chunky at the bottom. Let's remove some of these blocks to really get this teardrop curvature going. And see there, we have a lot nicer of a column. Basically, when you're making any sort of 3D shape, you have to imagine what the sides would look like if you took a nice slice out of it. In the case of the column here, you would end up with more of an oval shape. And so that's kind of the shape that we're going for when we're building this. And yeah, again, I could keep on finagling this shape until I get something a little bit more natural. And this is what I mean by it looks better with the bottom being the smallest, just because then it looks a little bit more natural than if you had it just kind of slowly extending to get fatter at the bottom. And of course, like with all things in Minecraft, this process gets more detailed as you scale up your build. Right now this is still a fairly small column, so I couldn't go very much extending outwards, but once I got to bigger columns here, I was able to make them fatter and make the teardrop shape much more pronounced. So now let's talk about fluting. As I said earlier, fluting is the channels you see carved into the shaft of a pillar. And the first thing anybody thinks about, of course, is this block, right here. This is the quartz pillar block. It's very obviously an attempt by the Mojang team to mimic the fluting you see in a traditional Greek column. And yes, it works great for a 1 block thick column. But the moment you try to bump this up any bigger, even to just like a plus shape, it tends to not work as well. The reason being is that the lines are too light and they're too close together for proper fluting. It especially looks really, really bad for larger scale things like this. So if I say replace with quartz pillar, it just loses all of its definition and no longer looks like fluting much at all. So what are we going to do instead? Well, I'm sure you've already seen it, but the main thing I like to do to make fluting is to use walls. Now, unfortunately, the only white wall block we have is the ugly diorite block, but for this example, that's what we're going to use. And basically, what I try to do is I try to keep these walls running as straight up and down as possible. So I'll start from the bottom here and just basically draw a line going up all the way up to the top. And you don't have to make them connect like that, but then you basically line all of your column with that. It gets a little bit awkward in things like corners, and you can kind of still shove in extra things in the corners, and that's usually fine to add some more extra detail into your build. But yeah, if you try to take that and, bring it round to this corner, it's going to look very extra weird. So it can take a little bit of finagling to actually get your walls to look the way you want them to look without them running into each other. But when you do get a look that you want, I find that it has the best look for an actual fluting. The other thing I would recommend doing is actually try to find a block that is lighter for your walls than your actual column is. This is just to emphasize the contrast between the fluting and the middle column. If this was all sandstone, you would barely even see the walls, and it wouldn't make that much of a difference. Whereas what you see here, most of this is actually mud with like some stripped jungle, but then the walls themselves are a sandstone, and they really stand out a lot more. They also brighten up your columns a bit at the end. So that pretty well covers how to do the shaft of the columns. Now I suppose I should give a few tips on how to make the capitals. This is a little bit more difficult to talk about, since scale plays an important role on how much detail you can actually add, and I really don't want to dictate how that should look for every build. So take this with a grain of salt, these are just suggestions. Doric capitals are usually pretty easy to make. All you have to do is, on a smaller scale, you just basically surround the neck of your shaft with, with stairs. That works for both this size and for like the plus size. You don't really need to go much more complex than this. For the plus size, something I would suggest doing is after you surround the neck here, I would take some slabs and just basically create the square portion at the very top. Square it up a bit. And that's really all you need to do for a Doric capital. They're pretty simple. If you're going up a little bit, then I just basically make more circles going up and then slap the square on top. You don't have to be complex, and in fact I would advise you to not go complex with this. It's meant to be simple. Going to the next classical order, the Ionic order is probably going to be the hardest one for you to replicate, actually, since spirals are not easy at all to make, even if you build on a larger scale. something I've seen some people do for smaller scale builds is that they'll actually take the quartz pillar block, or really any other block that has this target in it. So you're looking at things like the chiseled stone bricks, or like the sides of walls. And basically you're looking for that target texture to then place sideways like this, and sometimes they'll put like a button in the very center of the design, just to really give the illusion of those spiraling volutes, and they'll put that on either side of the column. That works really great for smaller stuff, but not so great when you're scaling up. And so when you're scaling up, I basically just tried my best to mimic a spiral, but this was like the smallest spiral I could muster here, and this is a fairly large size to be doing that with. So you really have to get good at manipulating stairs to try to make some tight spirals if you want to do the Ionic order and make it look good. When it comes to the Corinthian capital, it is very hard to downsize this one. I tried my best over here, and basically I had the best luck by basically spamming the dead coral block pretty much everywhere. On a larger scale, you basically have to work up from layers. I started out with layers that are just, simple stairs going back and forth, and then I started making more defined leaves. So this is a leaf coming out, then there's the diagonal leaf, and then on this scale we had I could actually start adding in more details that kind of make it look like the acanthus leaf, though you'll notice that I had to like punch out the back just to really emphasize that acanthus leaf look to it. And then, yeah, again, on this scale, I was able to really emphasize that full acanthus leaf look. And then I got a little bit of a spiral going on these corners. And it's really, really busy, it's really, really messy, but that's what the Corinthian style is supposed to look like. It's supposed to be very organic. And I will note that the very top, you're going to want, it's not just a big square on the top. You've actually got, it curves inwards towards the center to make more of a four-pointed star instead of a big old square. And otherwise, that is the Corinthian capital. Now, I could talk about the Tuscan and the Composite ones over here, but I really don't know that there's much I can elaborate on, since the Tuscan one is basically exactly the same as Doric, and the Composite one is just, mixing the Corinthian and the Ionic order there. So now you've got some proper Greek columns! Hooray! The hard part is done! No, really, the columns are the most iconic part of Greek architecture, so that pretty well is all you need to make your build look like a Greek temple. The next thing to talk about is proportions. You see, ancient Athens was filled with philosophers, mathematicians, and other smart people who took their maths and ideals very seriously. As such, there are specific ratios for basically everything in the temple that they considered to be ideal architectural form. Something, golden ratio something. For instance, on the Parthenon here, the front is 8 columns wide, while the side has 17 columns running down the length, since most Greek temples are approximately twice as long as they are wide. Why the length has 17 columns rather than 16 is beyond me. I don't know. There's also ratios comparing the diameter of the columns to the height that changes depending on what classical order is used, and then there's ratios of column height to entablature. I'll be honest, I won't even pretend that I paid much attention to these numbers when I was building this. I tend to be more of a looks good enough kind of person, so I totally winged it for these ratios. I will be the first person to admit that my so-called accurate replica of the Parthenon here is most likely not that accurate at all, since I didn't measure a darn thing while building this, and was instead just building based off of what it looked like. But for those of you who like numbers and accuracy, have some numbers! Let's see here. For the Doric order, the columns ranged from a 4:1 ratio of base diameter to column height to a 6:1 ratio. The 6-to-1 ratio was more common though, so you'd probably want to stick with that one. For the Ionic order, they have a 9-to-1 ratio between column height and the diameter, and the Corinthian order has a 10-to-1 ratio, with the capital being more than a tenth of the total height. The ratio of column height to entablature is usually either a 2-to-1 ratio or a 3-to-1 ratio. The Parthenon uses the 3-to-1 ratio. Alright, so now that we know the numbers, shall we see how well I did at eyeballing it? Let's see here. That's 7 wide for the base. And 42 wide for the height. So, hey, I was actually at a perfect 6-to-1 ratio there. Hooray! Alright, knowing that we have a 42 block high column, let's see how wide our entablature is. It is 121 blocks. That's a little bit more off, because, see here, 42 times 3 is like 126? 126. So that's a little bit off, but barely. So I'm gonna call that a win. Nailed it. I'll be honest, I was totally not expecting that. Well, I feel a little bit better about myself now. Alright, moving on. Now let's talk a little bit about carvings and statues. Now there were a couple of places you'd find decorative carvings around a Greek temple. The one you're probably most familiar with is, of course, the pediment here. Now these weren't just painted on, these were actually carved into the stone of the building. In some cases, they were freestanding statues. Now, typically, the pediment depicted scenes from the mythology about the god that the temple was built for. In the case of the Parthenon, it was built for Athena Parthenos. So, the back of the temple depicted the birth of Athena, while the front here told the story of Athena and Poseidon holding a competition to see who would be in charge of Athens. That's the general idea, is that you have these big statues that tell the story. Of course, if you're working with something smaller, I've seen some people do some really clever things with armor stands. I am not good enough with armor stands to even come close to doing that, but that is an option. The next location for carvings is the frieze. Now, the frieze is a part of the entablature that, it's the decorative part of the entablature, and it tends to look a little bit different depending on what classical order of architecture you're using. For the Doric order, the frieze is divided between triglyphs and metopes. The triglyphs, like the name suggests, are just these groups of 3 lines grouped together, and they're basically just dividing up these metopes. The metopes are the actual little tiny pictures that you get depicting different scenes and such. And usually what they did was they had scenes that glorified war, so you got a lot of people stabbing each other here. For the Ionic order, they didn't use triglyphs, and instead just had a single continuous band of sculpture that went all the way around the temple. For the other orders, the frieze gets less defined and is sometimes even left blank, so I'll leave that up to you. There are actually also sculptures on the inside of the colonnade as well, in a similar location to where it is on the frieze, just on the inner part of the temple here. And for the Parthenon, this one was decorated with pictures of a festival that had a lot of horses going around the temple. This is one of those details you can probably get away with leaving out of your build, since not many people are going to look up here. I think this is one of the things that I got a little bit wrong on the proportions, though, because I think it's a lot more visible on the Parthenon itself, whereas here you can barely see it up there. So, And, of course, there are almost always some sort of statue or other sculptures on the inside of the building as well. For the Parthenon, we've got the giant ivory and gold statue of Athena holding up Nike, the goddess of victory. And they had to put in a big basin of water on the inside of the temple here just to keep the ivory from drying out and getting ruined. Now that's obviously going to be different for any temple. This just happens to be what the inside of the Parthenon looked like. Now, the interiors for Greek temples were usually pretty simple. The Parthenon only really has two rooms, this main room and a treasury room in the back. And they're all just, big, big rectangles or squares that are held up with columns, another colonnade of smaller columns on the inside here, just to keep holding up the roof. Otherwise, essentially what you have is the big columns, a thick wall, and then the smaller columns inside. And that's pretty well all there is to these Greek temples. Now we also have these little tiny entrance rooms. The Parthenon has the bronze gates that are in the front here. But otherwise, there's very little by way of windows or other natural light that gets into these. So they're fairly dark, fairly simple, and that's basically as much as I can say about it. Here's that little treasury room in the very back of the building. It looks pretty similar with the same sort of entrance going on here, and then it just opens up into this itty-bitty little room back here. It actually had Ionic columns that were holding up this section on the interior here. It's different than all of the rest of the Doric order columns, but that's just how the Parthenon does, which is pretty cool. Otherwise, I think the final thing to talk about is the roof. Now, I think it's important to mention the angles of this triangle that forms the pediment here. Now, this is not a very steep roof. It tended to range from a 12.5 degree angle to a 16 degree angle. So if you're trying to build your roof out of stairs, which have a 45 degree angle, shame on you. Slabs are a little bit better, since it's like a 20-something degree angle, but that's still just a little bit too steep. So for a smaller scale build like this one, you actually want to make it 2 blocks wide, 2 slabs wide going across in order to get the shallow angle there. So you can see it, that's what I've got here, is just, groups of 2 slabs connected to each other. For making the larger scale here, what I actually ended up doing to find my angle is I actually took a straight line and used the rotate tool in World Edit. And basically I just selected this line and said rotate by, I think I said 15 degrees. And of course, World Edit yells at you if you do this, because it doesn't do the most precise of lines, but it gives you a close enough approximate that you can work with it. One thing that it does have issues with, though, is that it doesn't make repeating patterns very well. So the red line is actually what I ended up getting when I first plugged in the command. The orange line here is me turning that into a repeating pattern of what it would look like with a repeating pattern of 4 going across all the way. You can see it's pretty close, but just a little bit off. Honestly, it's still within parameters. If that's all you want to do, just do a repeating pattern of 4 to get that slope of the roof there. What I found was the best to get where I wanted to go, though, was actually 7 4s in a row, then a group of 2, then 7 more 4s, then another group of 2, and 7 more, and so on and so forth. That's actually what I ended up using for my final roof here. Also, when you're building your roof, I think the only other thing to really point out is because the roof was made with clay tiles, those tiles would slide right off the very end unless they had something to really hold them up. So that's what these little decorative dooley-wop things are for, is they're actually holding the clay tiles on. So you'd often see those running down the length of your roof. Otherwise, I think that pretty well covers everything I wanted to talk about for Greek architecture. There are, of course, lots of little tiny details that I haven't mentioned, but a lot of those come down to personal taste and change from temple to temple. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's been a bit of a wait for this one. I had to take a little bit of a maternity leave there. I'd like to start getting videos out more regularly again, but unfortunately I still can't quite guarantee that I'll be able to do that just yet. Turns out trying to do anything on the computer with a squirmy, noisy baby has proven to be a bit difficult. Thank you so much for continuing to support me and my channel, even with the large gaps between videos. It really means a lot to me that you guys have been so supportive in your comments and such. Since the last video, I actually made it past 5,000 subscribers, which is way more than I ever thought I would get, so a huge thank you to all of you. Hopefully you find the information I've provided to be useful, and I shall see you in the next video. Goodbye!